Let's return to one of our main stories this hour, the recapture of Mexico's most notorious drug lord, Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo. We're joined now by Laura Carlsen. She's a political analyst based in Mexico. Laura, thank you so much for your time. The president proudly tweeted, "Mission accomplished," to announce the government had recaptured El Chapo. But that certainly hasn't overshadowed the embarrassment of the drug baron escaping from prison not once but twice. Given President Peña Nieto's determination to save face on this issue, why would he extradite El Chapo to the US and not deal with him himself?
That's the big question right now. The United States is exercising a great deal of pressure to have El Chapo Guzman extradited. And clearly, if he is extradited, the message is that Mexico cannot assure that he will be sentenced and be held in prison because it has this terrible record of already 2 escapes. And those 2 escapes were not just technical problems in terms of the high security prisons. Everyone knows, and it's still not resolved in terms of exactly who's responsible, but everybody knows that these escapes were a result of corruption. So President Peña Nieto is kind of between a rock and a hard place. If he keeps El Chapo, there will be a lot of displeasure on the part of his main ally, the United States government, which is already filing the extradition papers. And if he doesn't, if he extradites him to the United States, in a sense, it'll be an admission of failure.
Clearly, the Mexican government is viewing this as a major coup, that they have recaptured the nation's most wanted man. But in terms of the difference that him being behind bars making to the drug trade at large, is there going to be much of a difference?
No, there won't be much of a difference. And we already know this because he was behind bars before. And it wasn't the end of the Sinaloa cartel, it wasn't the end of drug trafficking in Mexico, and it wasn't the end of the violence throughout the country. What we've seen is with this kingpin strategy, which is essentially when they take out a capo like El Chapo Guzman, who's the #1 in the country, there's normally an explosion of violence in the country. In other words, the impact on common citizens is often negative, because what happens is that other drug cartels see that this cartel has been weakened and they move in to take over the territory or to challenge the cartel and in turf wars in specific parts of the country. Or there's a fragmentation of the original cartel, and some of those smaller cartels are more violent and more invasive in local communities than actually the huge transnational cartel. So we're going to have to be on the lookout here in Mexico, and this will be the responsibility of the government to make sure that that explosion of violence is controlled, and that the capture of El Chapo Guzman that they're so proud of doesn't result in a worsening of the situation of both drug trafficking and public safety here in Mexico.
Laura, so many nations talk about fighting the war on drugs, winning the war on drugs. Given what you have just said, is that even remotely possible?
There's a growing consensus that it is absolutely not possible. And that consensus is based on over 40 years of history with this policy, mostly exported by the United States government. It has not resulted in diminishing the flow of illegal drugs to the United States. It has not improved public safety for the most part in most countries, and Mexico here is the classic example. So what we have here, in spite of all the announcements by the government of this huge victory, is perhaps a battle that's been won on a war that is lost. Because really, there's no way to end this war through this confrontation with the major drug cartel leaders, and without going to what the real roots are, which have to do with prohibition, which have to do with the some $40 billion that Mexico earns every year in illegal drugs going to mostly the US market, and that have to do with the kinds of corruption and complicity that are so widespread between government authorities and the drug cartels in Mexico and in other countries as well.
Laura, I think one of the most interesting parts of this story is that El Chapo was actually the architect of his own undoing by going to movie producers in the hope that they would make a film, and they then dobbed him in, if you like, to the authorities. But by and large, he is quite a popular figure with the public, having donated money to hospitals and schools and so forth. Given that, how has the public responded to his recapture?
The public has responded with a great deal of skepticism here in Mexico. There are parts, especially in his home state of Sinaloa, where he is popular and where they do not welcome this news. They think it's going to have effect on their local economies. They do see him as a benefactor of the local communities, and they believe that this will lead to more violence and some economic disruption. But there's also a great deal of belief that, as we were discussing before, this is not going to make a difference in the violence. If you look at the social networks, and I've been following what's being said both in the newspapers, in the media, as well as in the social networks, what they're saying is that this is not going to affect the situation of public safety here in Mexico, that this is largely a public relations move on the part of President Peña Nieto, that it was necessary. It's a criminal. He has to be behind bars, but it's being used to redeem the image of Mexico at a time when it's very low. There's a huge problem with the falling peso. There's a huge problem with corruption scandals, with the violence in the case of Ayotzinapa, 43 disappeared students, and other crimes that are going unsolved in the country. So it was needed a kind of a display of strength like this. And what people believe is that the government's more focused on the image than it is on the real problems that the citizens are facing, and that the capture of El Chapo Guzman is not going to resolve those problems.
We do live in troubling times. Laura Carlsen in Mexico, really appreciate your insight.